Welcome to the MCAT Basics podcast, brought to you by the physicians at Med School Coach. Each week, Sam Smith breaks down high-yield MCAT topics so you can score as high as possible on test day.
Hello, I am Sam Smith, and this is Sam's MCAT Basics. This podcast covers the most important topics put out on the AAMC MCAT each year, and I determined this list by going through all the official practice materials that the AAMC puts out, and also some third-party practice material, and just put together this big list of topics that consistently kept on showing up, and ranked those topics and made podcasts out of it. This podcast covers sociological groups. I'm going to go over quite a few different topics within groups, and this is going to include talking about the different types of sociological groups. I'm going to talk about organizations and a little bit about bureaucracy. I will talk about interactions between groups. I'll answer some questions like, what makes a group stable? What is the free rider effect? And how does that apply to medicine? And then I'll talk about groups applied to culture. And I'll give you guys a lot of different examples of when I bring up a term and define it. I hope that helps these concepts kind of stick with you after you listen. And this material will show up on one of the sections, and that is the psych-soc section of the MCAT. And inside the psych-soc, this is probably one of the highest yield subjects, if not the highest yield subject. So enjoy, and I hope it helps. So first, let's talk about social groups and social networks. So a social group within social sciences has been defined as two or more people who interact with one another, share similar circumstances, and collectively have a sense of unity. And so this is kind of a broad term for a cohesive group. You can kind of think of it as, so think of this as something like a neighborhood, peers, a mob is even a social group. And then a peer group is both a social group and a primary group of people who have similar interests, age, backgrounds, or social status. The members of this group are likely to influence a person's beliefs and behavior. And so that's something that's key to remember, is people within your peer group are the most likely to influence your beliefs and behavior. Think about the people you hung out with in high school, and whether you like it or not, these people had a really big impact on your life. It's likely, unless, you're kind of a social outcast or something, and that's how some people were in high school, and that's okay. But likely, a lot of the beliefs you have now or behaviors you have now came from friends or peers that were with you in high school or, even college. A reference group is a group to which an individual or another group is compared. And this is what sociologists call any group that individuals use as a standard for evaluating themselves and their own behavior. So, an example might be the political party that you're affiliated with. So you're going to look and see, okay, what are the beliefs of this party? You make sure that you align with those. Obviously there's some wiggle room, because sometimes you might say, okay, well, I don't like this policy, but, my reference group, which is my political party, believes it, blah, blah, blah. But just know, reference group is a group that you compare yourself to, or another group compares themselves to, and kind of checks their own behavior, or they act as a standard to check your own behavior or the group's behavior. So you might have noticed when I was talking about peer groups, I mentioned the word primary group. Well, a primary group is a small social group whose members share close, personal, enduring relationships. And these groups are marked by members' concern for one another and in shared activities and culture as well. And so these include people like your family, your long childhood friends, even, your high school friends, as I was talking about, people that you share close relationships with, primary group. And in contrast, people in a secondary group interact with you on a less personal level than those in a primary group. Their relationships are usually temporary instead of long lasting. And these relationships are formed more to exchange information. This might be a work relationship, might be, people that you're interacting with on a daily basis, but more of a professional setting. Like, say you go to the gym every day and you interact with the weight room staff. That's a secondary group. That's you say what's up, you say hi, how's your day going, but that's about the extent of your relationship. Maybe you'll ask them to come spot you at some point, but really you don't know them very well. So to sum it up in just a few words: primary group, family, friends; secondary group, acquaintances. And I know you might be thinking, okay, what about in-group, out-group? Well, this is pretty simple. So an in-group is a social group to which a person psychologically identifies as being a member. And one of my favorite examples of an in-group is a group of people who share the same name. So, you might go introduce yourself to somebody, or in the case of me, I introduce myself to somebody. They say, "Oh, hi, nice to meet you. My name's Sam." And I say, "Oh, my name's Sam too." And then you make some corny joke of, "Oh, nice to meet you, Sam. What a great name, blah, blah, blah." And so, you share that connection of having the same name as somebody. And you find a little connection, and a little bit of an in group, and you kind of understand each other because you're both named Sam. And so, what about out-group? Well, an out-group is just the opposite. So it's a social group with which you do not identify. And, you can just think of this as a group of people that you don't really necessarily associate with. And so, in terms of education, what I always thought it was the business majors. I honestly had no idea what they were learning about every day. What does a business major learn about? What do they do? I'm not part of that. I'm not part of that group. I don't really understand that. So, that's kind of an out-group. And keep in mind that these in-group, out-groups can be ethnicity, nationality, gender, religion. Can be a bunch of different stuff. I kind of came up with silly examples, but remember that these can be more serious connections or more serious topics. And so lastly, I briefly want to touch on what a social network is. So a social network is a social structure made up of a set of social actors. These can be individuals or organizations, and a set of dyadic ties between these actors. And so you can think about these ties as just like a big spider web. So it's basically taking a zoomed out view on social structure of a person or an organization, and kind of looking at the connections between everything. So think of it as like this big spider web, and you're looking at all these different connections between people, between organizations. And so some sociologists use these social networks to better understand different social events or different activities that go on, stuff like getting jobs. Some use it to kind of study the economy. But just know that these social networks just connect all these people together and give us kind of an overview of how people are connected socially. All right, the next thing I want to talk about are organizations. So an organization is defined as an entity comprising multiple people, such as an institution or association, that has a collective goal and is linked to an external environment. So two big main points that describe organizations are: number one, they have a collective goal, and they're linked to some external environment. And that is to say that basically these organizations serve some kind of purpose out in the real world. And there are 4 different kinds of organizations that you need to know. There are formal organizations, coercive organizations, utilitarian organizations, and normative organizations. So now that you understand what the 4 types of organizations are, let's kind of take a deeper look into each of them. Formal organizations are organizations that are highly organized to meet a specific need. Again, highly organized. And so this is a good example of a formal organization is something like the military. And next you have coercive organizations. And these are organizations in which you cannot willingly leave. And, first thing that comes to mind are prisons. You can't willingly leave a prison. And next, you have utilitarian organizations. And these are organizations in which we join with a specific goal in mind. And so most sociologists will point out that people join this type of organization with money on their minds, as my good friend Sam Smith, not me, a different one, said. In other words, members of utilitarian organizations are often paid for their membership, or they are in some way reimbursed for their participation. And good examples of these are like businesses, corporations, colleges, universities. These teachers are getting paid, they're getting reimbursed. And the last type of organization I want to mention is the normative organization. And so a normative organization is one in which individuals join in order to promote an important social cause. And so you can think of these mostly as volunteer organizations, stuff like soup kitchens, or MAD, which is Mothers Against Drunk Driving, the Junior League, so on. These are usually to promote really good social causes, and they really help people out. So normative organization. Before I forget, I want to mention that organizations can also be split up in a different way. So, not the 4 that I just listed. Instead, they can be broken down into either formal or informal organizations. And so formal organizations are organizations that are planned. This is organizations like firehouses or, police departments, and where people say, we need these, we need them now, we're going to have them here, boom, build them, go on. So again, formal are planned organizations. Informal are spontaneously formed organizations. And so these are a little more abstract. A good example that comes to my mind is something like, say you eat lunch in the same place every day. You don't know these people, but you guys all eat lunch together the same place every day. Eventually you start talking, you share common interests. You form a little group right there. You form a little coalition, your little lunch group coalition. And, you talk about whatever, maybe you start fighting for some cause. Boom. That is a informal organization, right? Spontaneously formed. Another term you might see relating to organizations is bureaucracy. And so a bureaucracy is the administrative system governing any large institution. And the most important thing to know about bureaucracies are the 5 different principles of the ideal bureaucracy. And it's important to note that these were developed by Max Weber, who is a very famous sociologist. You probably have heard of him. And these 5 principles are as follows. Number 1, you want to have a division of labor, divide and conquer. And number 2, you want to have a hierarchy of organization. So you want to have a boss at the top, a few people under him, a few people under them, even more people going down, down, down. You want to have a pyramid structure in terms of the hierarchy. And number 3, an ideal bureaucracy is going to have lots of rules and regulations. And, I'm sure when you hear the word bureaucracy, or, someone's going to say, oh, all that bullshit bureaucracy, you think of rules and regulations and paperwork. And so that's kind of how I remember that. And the 4th principle is impersonality. And what that's trying to get at is trying to say that, everyone's treated fairly. You don't like one person more than the other. You treat everyone the same. And obviously, that's not how all bureaucracies work today. But in an ideal world, that's how it would work. And the 5th principle of the ideal bureaucracy is that employment is based on technical qualifications. And what this is supposed to do is just kind of cut out any kind of favoritism or discrimination. So, your employer or an employer might say, oh, my friend Dave is great, I'm going to employ him. But, he might not be the best one for the job, and he's only getting that job because his friend is the boss. And, that only hurts the business, and it makes for a weaker organization. So again, those are the 5 principles of an ideal bureaucracy. All right, the last thing I want to talk about here is an idea developed by Ferdinand Tonis. And it is the idea of a Gemeinschaft and a Gesellschaft. And if you're not saying it with a German accent, you're not doing it right, because it is a German word. And these translate into community and society. So Gemeinschaft is community and Gesellschaft is society. And these terms are used in two different ways. So the term Gemeinschaft, which is again community, is used to describe personal social ties and in-person interactions in society, and kind of, again, these close-knit ties of a community. And, the way that I remember this is Gemeinschaft. I remember mine, like it's your community, my community, Gemeinschaft. So that's how I remember that. On the other hand, Gesellschaft, which again is society, is used to describe more of these impersonal or indirect social ties between people. So, things like emails or telephone conversations, stuff that are interactions, but they aren't face-to-face and they're kind of impersonal. Think of Gesellschaft. So again, quickly sum it up. Gemeinschaft, these are close-knit community interactions. And Gesellschaft, these are more impersonal, not face-to-face interactions. And you might be wondering, why am I describing these terms in the part where I'm discussing organizations? And so this is because the way that Ferdinand Tones originally kind of coined these terms was an application to societal systems. So, he saw the Gesellschaft societal system as one that was full of these big government bureaucracies and large industrial organizations that were just kind of impersonal. And he saw these starting to come up, in the time when he wrote his piece on these terms, which I think was in the late 1800s. And he saw the Gemeinschaft social system as more of like a rural, peasant-based society. And so that's the reason why I threw it into organizations. But just know those two terms. You might see them on the MCAT. All right, now that I'm done talking about organizations, let's get on to the next topic, which is interactions within groups. So let's start with a few definitions here. The first thing you should know is what groupthink is. So groupthink occurs when a group with a particular agenda makes irrational or problematic decisions because its members value harmony and coherence over accurate analysis and critical evaluation. In other words, members of a particular group disregard their own personal opinions because they don't want to go against the group. They just want everyone to be happy together. So, in a big decision, everyone might say, okay, that's fine, even though, quite a few of them might have the opposite opinion or a different opinion than the decision that the group makes. So a really good historical example of groupthink is the Salem witch trials. And so there's a few factors that aided in this groupthink. And the first of that is that the Salem villagers were a very, very highly cohesive group that was very isolated. So, they all had the same religious beliefs. They were Puritans. Because of this, they were very, very cohesive, very tight group. The second factor that aided in their groupthink was the fact that they had a very forceful leader. And so this guy named Reverend Samuel Parris, great first name, by the way, he was the first ordained minister of the Salem village. And he ruled very strictly, was known for his greedy nature, and kind of seemed like the type of person who wouldn't let you speak your mind. And so that's one thing you need to remember about groupthink. Often there is one very forceful leader. In addition to the forceful leader, another factor that led to the groupthink in the Salem witch trials was the fact that it was very high stress. So leading up to the Salem witch trials in 1692, there was a very tough winter, put a lot of strain on Salem. So these factors of a close-knit group, which was isolated, a tough leader, and then a very tough winter that put a lot of stress on Salem kind of added up and led to the events where people were blaming each other for being witches, and then you had people who were too afraid to speak up because they didn't want retaliation. And so, this is kind of a classic example of groupthink because people censored their own opinions of the matter and said, hey, they never spoke up and said, hey, this is bullshit. This person's not a witch, because they were afraid they were going to get blamed. And this would lead to further chaos and further deterioration of the feeling of harmony and coherence of that group. And so looking back, I think it's easy to say, man, these people are crazy. How could they ever do this to other people? And you have to always think that the phenomenon called groupthink is responsible for this. So, people will often censor their own opinions and go along with a certain agenda that seems problematic or irrational because they value harmony or coherence of some group, which in this case was the Puritans. Group polarization is a phenomena that's kind of similar to groupthink. However, group polarization refers to the tendency for a group to make decisions that are more extreme than the initial inclination of its members. And these decisions can go either way. And so what I mean by this is that when members of a group have some extreme opinion on something, it's going to get even more extreme. And if they have a cautious opinion on something, say they all have a cautious opinion, it's going to become even more cautious. So you got to remember that the tendency goes either way. So it makes extreme more extreme or cautious more cautious. And just to give kind of a physics comparison, think of this as two waves adding up, right? So everyone in the room is a wave, and they're on phase with each other, the waves are. And because of that, you're going to have amplification of these waves. And so, to give you a brief example, imagine you have a group of dog haters that's assembled. Yes, I know, unrealistic, but they get together and they start discussing this. And, some of them have opinions that they really dislike dogs. I can't stand dogs. Get dogs out of my sight. And some others are, I kind of like them, but I avoid them whenever I'm out. I would never have one. And, some of them maybe have dogs, but just don't get along with their dog. Maybe their dog poops all over the house, whatever. So after a long discussion, kind of around a round table, they come to the decision that all dogs should be banned in the U.S., right? So some of them started with very intense opinions. Some of them may have even started with the opinion that dogs should be banned in the U.S. But after this discussion, the group becomes polarized and everyone gets amped up, and now they suggest banning all dogs in the U.S. All right, now that I've talked about group polarization, let's talk a little bit about conformity and compliance. So conformity is a change in behavior or belief toward a group standard as a result of the group's influence on an individual. So conformity then is a type of social influence through which group members come to share similar beliefs and standards of behavior. And it includes the processes by which group members converge on a given standard of belief or behavior, as well as the pressures they exert on one another to uphold these standards of behavior. On the other hand, you have compliance, and compliance is behavioral conformity in order to achieve rewards or avoid punishments. In other words, this is basically like public conformity, but not private conformity. You do some behavior because you're told to, or else you're going to be punished, but internally you don't believe in that behavior. So again, conformity is you are internalizing some behavior or some viewpoint. And conformity, on the other hand, is where you externally exhibit some behavior because you're part of a group or someone's told you to, but internally you're like, hey, this sucks. I don't believe in this crap. All right, let's quickly mention what determines group stability or cohesiveness. And I'm going to talk about this in terms of dyads, which are 2-member groups, and triads, which are 3-member groups. So dyads are basically considered the fundamental social group. However, Triads are more stable because there is an intermediary that's able to kind of mediate arguments and disagreements, and you can have a majority vote, on certain decisions. This is a pretty obvious fact, but something that is worth mentioning. And one way I like to think about this is thinking about business partnerships. So when you have a business partner, there's going to be a lot of arguments, and it's going to take a lot of effort to reach a big decision when there's only two of you. But if you have three people, let's say, you're the owner, you have a co-owner with you, and then you hire a CEO, and you say, we're all on the equal playing field in terms of this business. And now you have three people, and now you can take votes, and the majority can rule on decisions, and decisions are made much, much faster. So it's a much more stable, much more productive relationship to have a triad than a dyad. So what about bigger groups? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about working together in groups and some of the social phenomena that you should know in terms of working in groups. A term you may have heard or come across is the term social loafing. And so this is when people are working in a group and describes a phenomenon in which people are prone to exert less effort on a task when they're working on that task in a group versus when they're working alone. And just a little bit of background on social loafing. The first known research on the social loafing effect began in 1913 with the Max Ringelmann study. He found that when he asked a group of men to pull a rope, they did not pull as hard collectively as they did when they were individually pulling the rope. And this research did not distinguish whether this was the result of individuals in a group putting in less effort or of poor coordination within that group. Further research down the road kind of showed that people really do exert less effort when they're in groups. And sometimes it is the case, sometimes it's not. But when it is the case, it's called social loafing. And just kind of interestingly, women actually exhibit less social loafing than men across different cultures. And so related to the social loafing effect is the free rider effect. And that is when people in the group will relax because they know others will pick up their slack. And this kind of describes why people social loaf. So, we've all had group projects in college and high school or whatever. And you're going to have one teammate, usually, I hope you don't, that uses the free rider effect to get by. They kind of just, you might be texting like, hey guys, when do you want to meet up and work on the project? And maybe they don't respond, maybe they don't want to do much, but it seems like there's always that one person that kind of just relaxes because they know these other people are going to pick up their slack, and that's known as the free rider effect. And you can also have something called the sucker effect, and that is when a productive group member realizes that there's others free riding, and then they quit working hard because they don't want to be a sucker. And that's how I remember that. Sucker effect, person doesn't want to be a sucker, and so they quit working hard. A somewhat similar idea to the idea of the loafing effect is the idea of social facilitation. And this is also called the audience effect, and it's the tendency for people to perform differently when in the presence of others than when alone. And it's important to note that social facilitation pushes you towards your more dominant performance. So this is to say, if you are very good when you're alone and you don't make any mistakes, and you feel very comfortable about, say a presentation in front of a bunch of people, then you're bound to do even better when you're presenting to a group of people. But on the other hand, if you're making a bunch of small mistakes when you're presenting alone, you're bound to make even more mistakes. And this is all based on the increase in the level of arousal that you feel when you're in front of this group of people. So again, let me summarize that. Simple tasks, better performance, hard tasks, worse performance. People around us can have even other effects on our behavior. There's a term called de-individuation, and this is basically mob mentality. So, when you're in a mob, you are no longer thinking as an individual, right? You're in this big group, you're watching other people around you, people are watching you, and you end up doing bad stuff that you wouldn't be doing alone. So let's say you usually don't steal, but you're in the middle of a mob and they're looting a store, so this makes you more likely to loot. So to summarize that, de-individuation is the loss of self-awareness when you're part of a group. Another behavioral phenomena is called the bystander effect. And the bystander effect is when the presence of others discourages an individual from intervening in some emergency situation. And so you can kind of think of this in other words of basically, someone's getting attacked and all these people are walking by. There's bystanders, they're watching it, but no one does anything. And the more bystanders there are, the less likely it is that someone helps in the bystander effect. The most famous example of the bystander effect is the murder of Kitty Genovese. On March 13th, 1964, Genovese was stabbed, sexually assaulted, and murdered while walking home from work at 3 a.m. in Queens, New York. And according to an article put out by the New York Times, 38 witnesses watched the stabbings and did absolutely nothing to either intervene or even call the police. And, obviously when you hear this story, it's pretty shocking. But this led psychology researchers to describe an effect that is now known as the bystander effect. When a group of people see something happening, emergency situation, they're less likely to act than if they were alone. Another term that you should know in relation to groups is stereotype threat. And, this is more of an effect that happens to different groups of people, not necessarily interactions between people, as I was talking about the earlier examples. But stereotype threat refers to the risk of confirming negative stereotypes about an individual's racial, ethnic, gender, or cultural group. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize the original study that was done to kind of exhibit this stereotype threat. And hopefully that will give you a little bit of a better understanding of what exactly that means. So back in 1995, which is a great year to be born, by the way, stereotype threat was coined, the term, and it was coined by two psychologists named Steele and Aronson. And so the study that they developed this term stereotype threat was like this. They had two different conditions. In one condition, they had black students who were taking a test, and before the test, they would essentially say, all right, here's the test. It's known that black students perform worse on this test. Here you go ahead and take it. And they had another condition in which they just gave the students a test and didn't mention anything about how either black students performed worse or better. They didn't say anything of that. They just gave them the test and said, take it. And what they found out was that students that were told that historically black people performed worse on the test did in fact perform worse. And the black students that they did not tell them that black students performed worse, performed just as well as other ethnicities of students. In this case, they were comparing them to white students. So it seemed that just the researchers acknowledging the fact that black people did worse on the test actually made them perform worse on the test. And so that is called stereotype threat. And just so you know, this was a very summarized version of the experiment that they performed. There were actually 4 different tests that they did. You can go read about it. Go read their paper that was published in 1995 if you really want to know everything. That was a very brief synopsis. So again, just to summarize it all, stereotype threat is the risk of confirming a negative stereotype just on the basis of being presented with that stereotype. All right, now that I've talked about interactions within groups, let's go on and talk about groups in terms of culture. All right, groups in terms of culture. So there's going to be 4 terms that you really need to know for the MCAT as far as groups in terms of culture. So this is going to be a very short part of the podcast. The first term is assimilation. And so assimilation is a gradual process by which a person or group belonging to one culture adopts the practices of another and thereby becomes a member of that culture. So assimilation, you adopt the views and practices of another culture. And the next term you need to know is separation. So separation occurs when an individual rejects the dominant or host culture in favor of preserving their culture of origin. So separation is often facilitated by immigration to ethnic enclaves. And so, people immigrating from China might move to Chinatown and therefore aren't exposed to American culture. And so again, separation occurs when somebody immigrates and rejects the host culture. And the next term you need to know is integration. So integration occurs when an individual is able to adopt the cultural norms of the dominant or host culture while maintaining their culture of origin. And integration leads to and is often synonymous with biculturalism. So integration, you adopt the host culture and you also keep your own. And the last term you need to know is marginalization. And marginalization occurs when an individual rejects both their culture of origin and the host dominant culture. So again, let me briefly go over those. Assimilation. You drop your own culture, adopt the new culture. Separation. You do not adopt the new culture and you maintain your old culture. Integration. You maintain your culture and you also pick up the new culture that you moved to. And marginalization is you drop both cultures. So you can see this is kind of like a plus minus, plus plus, minus minus, minus plus. It's kind of like a four-way combination of different ideas. And with that, the podcast is finished. Thanks for listening. I hope that this podcast on groups and sociology helped you. Don't forget that there are plenty of other good resources to use on psych and soc sections of the MCAT. Definitely check out Khan Academy. I went through every one of their videos. Very helpful. Definitely good for memorization. They give lots of examples and stuff. So use that as well. Hope this helps. All right, so now for the MCAT advice of the day. So the advice I have today is directly and specifically applied to cars. And it is that when you're reading the passages, kind of try to be, pumped up about reading it or pretend like it's, the most interesting piece of information you've ever read, even though half of these passages obviously are about 19th century art that is frankly really boring. But try to get pumped up and think about it like you read it, like you are the author, and this is your life's work, and it's great, and just get super excited to read it, and think, okay, cool, I get to learn about Vincent van Gogh and his starry-eyed night painting, or whatever. Just try to get excited about it. And what I think this does is it kind of forces you to focus on the passage. Your mind doesn't kind of run off, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh shit, what did I just read? I don't remember the paragraph I just read. It kind of helps focus your attention, and that way you pick up on details that they'll ask questions about, and hopefully you'll be able to answer.
Each episode of MCAT Basics is brought to you by Med School Coach. To access Med School Coach services, including MCAT tutoring and medical school admissions advising, visit our website at medschoolcoach.com. Good luck as you prepare for the MCAT, and we hope you tune in again next time.
Come on, Murph. I'm trying to podcast over here, dude.